Welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about the drama triangle, the Karpman drama triangle. This is a model used to explain the components of the personality. Usually when we're talking about this, we're thinking about the associated behavioral expressions of those components. This was originally designed as a model for dysfunctional relational interactions, but today we're going to use it to explicate functional relational interactions in addition to the dysfunctional. The individual or the self has, according to Karpman, has three different components. The first one is called the challenger. This is the part of the self when it's engaged and it's undamaged and well-functioning. This is the part of us that can assert. This is a part of us that can defend ourselves when necessary. We can defend others. We can step up. We can speak up. We can be seen. We can engage. And from a leadership perspective, when this part of the self is engaged and well-functioning, the leader can use power responsibly and challenge. The second part of the self, according to Karpman and David Emerald, when it's undamaged and well-functioning, we call it the attuned part of the self. When the attuned part of the self is undamaged and well-functioning, we can be conscious of our own limitations. We can be capable of grief. We can be conscious of our own wounds. We can run the negative emotions without being too affected by it. We can be sad. We can be angry. We can, depression. All this is part of being alive and being in the world, so we don't get too troubled by that. And having this attuned part of the self out in the world, engaged and well-functioning and undamaged, translates in a leadership perspective that the leader will be able to relate to those whom they lead. Now, the third part of the human psyche, or the third part of the Karpman triangle, according to Emerald, is the helper-contributor. Now, when the helper-contributor is undamaged and it's out in the world well-functioning, that's when we can consider and include others. We can express compassion and empathy, not just in feeling, but in action. And we can give, we can contribute, we can be out there basically participating in a giving way. Now, from a leadership perspective, that means leaders, when this part of the psyche is out there and it's healthy and it's active, can facilitate the potential for their people to emerge. And this translates into healthy organizational cultures. Now, when the challenger, the helper, and the attuned work together and they're engaged and the self is undamaged and functioning and engaged in the world, they work together like a well-oiled machine. There's not much separation between them. And that begets competent relationality, creative leadership, and so on. Now, when we find clients who are stuck in the negative socialized mind or the instrumental self-sovereign mind, this is the nomenclature from the Immunity to Change people. When we find clients who are stuck in those modalities, those ways of approaching the world, usually you're looking at some history of trauma or some unhealed emotional wounds or something's troubling the person. So to be clear, to define the negative socialized mind, the negative manifestation of the socialized mind, is a hyper concern of, do I fit in? Am I good enough? And the instrumental self-sovereign mind would be very black and white thinking. Either I'm good or I'm bad, or I fit in or I don't fit in. So it becomes very black and white. When we find people stuck in the negative socialized mind or the instrumental self-sovereign mind, usually there is some history of trauma, some unhealed emotional wounds, some overwhelm, some stuckness. Now, if we looked through that same circumstance of someone being stuck in a negative socialized mind or the instrumental self-sovereign mind, according to Karpman, the challenger, the attuned, and the helper-contributor have split apart and they've distorted. That's just another way to look at the same thing, to think of the same dynamic. When you've got trauma or unhealed wounds active, or someone's being dysfunctional in workplace, this is the Karpman Emerald way to look at it. The challenger transforms into the perpetrator. The morphs into the perpetrator. And you can see that the components separate and they distort. So when that happens, the challenger transforms into the perpetrator. This is when we see people striking out, lashing out. The individual can be passive, can be aggressive or passive-aggressive. There's retaliation. Now we see this panning out or playing out in leadership when you see tyrannical leadership, a tyrannical leadership style. You see someone being paranoid, you see someone being manipulative, and so on. When there is trauma or unhealed wounds or there's dysfunction and these things are active, we see the attuned part of the self turn into the victim. We see this, you'll see people rationalizing retaliation. You'll see them seeing the world through kind of a victim filter. You see them accessing power via the victim posture. And this tends to be, the victim posture tends to be a fear-based, shame-based way to kind of approach the world. So from a leadership perspective, we see this playing out. The leader will be kind of suspicious, will be a little bit paranoid, and be righteous about that paranoia because in some way they perceive themselves as being victimized. Now, when we see dysfunction or we see trauma or unhealed wounds and that those things are active, we see the helper contributor turn into the savior. This is an extreme version of the helper contributor. Now, when the helper contributor turns into the savior, in other words, when trauma or unhealed wounds are active and present, a person will tend to give too much of themselves away. They'll tend to sacrifice themselves. Typically, they'll have inappropriate boundaries when it comes to giving and receiving. Oftentimes, a person will sentimentalize him or herself or idealize him or herself for having given themselves away, essentially throwing themselves at a cause or a circumstance. In leadership, this tends to manifest in kind of a missionary style of leadership. The statement of missionary leadership is essentially, I know what you need. I'm going to give you what you need by my definition, regardless of what you might actually need. So when we see the parts of the self separate and distort, instead of relationality, we end up with imbalance, separation, extremes, dysregulation, and so on. So when we relate or lead from our wounds, we are split apart, according to Karpman. We're going to see through this Karpman lens, the parts of the self split and they distort. And oftentimes we'll see ourselves swinging from these parts. So oftentimes we start by giving away too much of ourselves, kind of the savior. We're going to rush in and we're going to save everybody. I see this happening a lot with my clientele because I work a lot with physicians. They come in and they just completely give themselves away. They often throw themselves at their work to the point that their personal needs are neglected, which often becomes unsustainable. And we often see people swinging away from the savior into the victim energy, and there's a wild swing. And most often I see these playing out together. I see people going from the savior to the victim, throwing themselves at something, keep giving too much of themselves away, and then they feel victimized by that. And the swings, once again, these are separated, so they're not communicating. And then we'll often see a wild swing up into the perpetrator, justifying retribution. I gave myself up, I gave so much of myself away, and they took me for granted. Therefore, now I have a right to whatever, fill in the blank, criticize them, be judgmental of them, and so on. And we often see wild swings of these going back and forth. So when we see these parts of the self separated by whatever, overwhelm, trauma, histories of wounds, you name it, that's when we end up with imbalance, separation, extremes, dysregulation, and so on. Our job as professional listeners is to help reform these, reshape these, get these back into the round, and get them integrated again. So we go from imbalance, separation, extremes, and dysregulation into relationality. We trend ourselves and our clients to higher levels of adult development, and that can help to reform and reintegrate the challenger, the attuned, and the helper contributor back into relationality. And that relationality, of course, is the challenger becomes active, engaged, deattuned, the helper and contributor, and they all are communicating, and there's kind of a reciprocity between the three, an integration of these parts of the self. They communicate, they're connected. When that happens from a leadership perspective, we lead with more maturity. We reclaim wasted cognitive and emotional energies, and we relate better in personal, social, and professional relationships, which helps us in any context. So from an organizational perspective, when these parts of the self are integrated and they're communicating and we've got relationality, we help organizations reclaim their most valuable resource, which is the cognitive and emotional energies of their people. And when we say emotional, what we're talking about is the passion. People show up with their passion. When these parts of the self are well-formed, well-shaped, issues of trauma, emotional wounds, overwhelm, all of these things are mitigated. We reclaim that valuable resource. So now we're going to take some time. I'm going to allow for questions and answers. I want to hear what you think.